Dear church, let's talk about teaching versus preaching. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley, joined again by Jake Sledge.
Hey.
Thanks for being here again. We're in a series called, I think we called it Ministry Matters. We're talking about matters or issues surrounding ministry. Last week, we talked about recharging our batteries as ministers. This week, we're talking about teaching versus preaching. And when we were lining out some of the subjects that we were going to talk about in this, we talked about what are some of the ancillary or peripheral things associated with ministry that we don't always talk about, but are issues nonetheless. And this is one that came up, both of us thought about, is that there is a difference between teaching a Bible class and preaching a sermon. And I can't tell you how many times I hear from preachers, one or the other, they'll say, well, I feel really confident in the pulpit, but I don't feel confident as a classroom teacher. Or some that say, I really like teaching class, but I don't feel as confident in the pulpit. And it makes you consider that there is a bit of a difference, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's what we want to talk about today a little bit, maybe give some guidance or, you know, I don't know if we can give words of wisdom. We're not very wise, but maybe we can help folks.
We can give words.
We can give words and you can decide if they're wise. But maybe we can help preachers when it comes to teaching versus preaching, identifying the problem and then going forward as to, you know, maybe how we become better teachers and preachers. So I think where I would start is I would say there are some similarities, obviously. Yeah. When we talk about teaching and preaching, the similarities are you have the same goal and you're using the same book, obviously. But also there are some differences. Some don't see that there is a difference. They treat one just like the other. But I think it's important to understand that there are differences because there are, at least in my mind, some topics that are better suited for a Bible class versus preaching. I think about the topic that we affectionately call MDR, marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Certainly, I've preached on that topic, just did yesterday. But to get into a deep dive discussion about that is better suited probably for a Bible class where you can have interaction. So many times you walk away from that subject with more questions than you do answers. So maybe it's better suited for a Bible class setting. And there's some other topics that are like that. I also think that there is a tendency maybe to treat the two the same. And so it's just lecture and each time. But I think the goal of preaching or teaching should be transformation, not just reciting information. And so maybe a lecture style format is what you're comfortable with, but at the end of the day, we need to answer the question, so what? So how does this help me? And a discussion about that lends itself much better, obviously, in a Bible class setting. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the first point you made about the textbook is the same and the goal is the same. I think there's really something significant there for people to understand because sometimes what we see in churches in the pulpit as well as in classrooms is not some agreement on we're supposed to be using the same textbook here.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's open discussion. Hey, anything you want to talk about, or it's stories, or it's another book or resource that the teacher or preacher is using, and they make that primary instead of just reference material to get an idea or help with understand a concept or explain a concept. And so I think that is fundamental to understand that we're supposed to be coming from the same textbook, the same source. And so we want to definitely encourage that. And then the goal, I do believe, like what you said, is the same. It is ultimately transformation. Romans 12, 1 and 2, we want people to become more like Christ. We are helping people become and grow in their following as a follower of Christ.
Let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
Because when it comes to teaching or preaching, I see this happen a lot where, with preaching, you come up with 2 research papers a week and then you present them. Orally to the congregation. And I think it's about so much more than that, just as I think teaching a Bible class is about more than just reading through a verse and then asking, what does this mean? And then moving on to the next one and asking what that means and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, how does this apply? How does this make me a better disciple? Because we are all limping disciples. And so I think the key, whether it's teaching or preaching, the key is help me to be like Jesus. Give me the hope that I need to be like Jesus. And sometimes yes, that requires, some tough love. Maybe, there's the subject matter lends itself to things that maybe expose or highlight a problem, and the whole hellfire and brimstone stuff. And maybe it's a difficult subject to preach on, but you don't avoid it. But at the end of the day, you leave hope, even if it's the subject of like hell. That can be a pretty depressing topic. But at the end of the day, you don't have to go there, right? So there's hope, and we've got to preach to transformation, not just about giving information. Which brings me to a question I had for you: is when it comes to Bible classes, some of the pitfalls that we see. I think about how so often our Bible classes turn into a history lesson. So let's say we're talking about the book of Luke. We spend an inordinate amount of time talking about the history surrounding the text, or around a passage. That's fine to do some background and setup, but so many of our Bible classes turn into just a history lesson and not ever zeroing in on what the text actually says.
Yeah. There's some people who are teachers and they just love the history, so they gravitate to that.
Yeah.
Other times what I see is people are preparing for it and they haven't really put much thought into understanding what the goal is. And so they just go to commentaries. And I've used the illustration that they open the commentary, they turn it over and they just shake it, and whatever comes out that and naturally a commentary is going to cover a good amount of history about that particular letter.
Right.
And the setting and that sort of thing. There's a place for that. And I think if you are the teacher or the preacher, you need to have a grasp on that. I don't think that that's really super important for a Bible class. I think some to help set the stage is okay, but I don't think if you've got a whole quarter to teach on Luke, I don't think you spend a whole class, 2 classes, 3 classes, setting up all of the history of, the whole context and the set. I don't think that's necessary.
Right.
I think that's some very, very front-end preliminary stuff. I don't even think necessarily that's what you start the class with.
Right.
I think you might hit at that. I've got a lesson coming up where I'm coming from Hebrews. And when you look at this is where I think that some history context can be helpful, and how you can use it is to understand that the Hebrew Christians there in that letter, they were in a very similar kind of situation. I mean, their lives were at stake and ours are not, at least in this country. However, holding on to your faith, not giving up, endurance, patience till the end, an ungodly world, an ungodly context. So that's where you can connect, people with, we're different, but we're not, a lot of things are still the same though too. So,
right.
So understand, see yourself in this same reality.
Yeah. The cultural context is highly important when we're interpreting scripture. So don't mean to diminish that, but I think all too often we kind of focus on the history and less on the text. But I also think another pitfall that we run into with teaching class is that, we kind of get bogged down in the weeds. We want to focus on the ancillary things or the peripheral things, like, was it a whale or what kind of fish was it in Jonah? Look, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't. And we can spend a whole class or two talking about that, and it doesn't matter. Does it really matter if the forbidden fruit was a pomegranate or an apple? And so we can get lost in the weeds, and I think that lends to another pitfall, which is so often a Bible class teacher or the preacher who's teaching a Bible class comes in and they're not quite as prepared, and so they're counting on chasing a rabbit to be the class, or they're counting on, a discussion. They lob a question out there that's more philosophical that never lands anywhere, and we're going to let that kind of drive the class. And I've actually heard of elders and preachers say, they like to teach the younger kids, like the teens or the junior high, because, they can kind of get away with that more. They can come in there and they can kind of, lob a discussion. They don't have to be as prepared. And I'm thinking, teenagers, man, they know if you're unprepared better than anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, they are astutely aware of whether you are prepared or not,
Yeah.
and they just may not be outspoken about it. So I think those are some pitfalls, some dangers. We've got to be prepared. We've got to be willing to do the hard work of digging in and getting us to transformation.
I totally agree. You've got, and that's why preparation is so important. You've got to do the preparation up front to have a grasp of, like if you're doing a sermon series or if you're doing a class series, to understand where am I ultimately going in this whole series. I've got to cover Luke, for example. We're using Luke. So I need to get to the end. What's the theme of Luke? Where am I going with this? So that means I don't have to cover the location of all the cities. Right. I don't have to cover, I don't have to even put the map up necessarily. Sometimes I think that can be helpful. It can be an aid. But what is Luke? Why did God give us Luke? We don't have the account of the fall or of Jonah so that we can debate whether, was it a whale or a fish, an apple or a fig or pomegranate. That's not why God gave that to us.
Right.
So that's our job, is to to deliver the message of God's message.
Yeah, what is God
people.
saying?
Yeah.
That is the big question that we try to get out of every text that we're studying is, what is God saying? How does this apply to me? How do I take this and allow it to make me a better disciple? And I think, we can very easily get off track or get lost. I will say this, the pitfall I just mentioned about not being prepared and all that, the shepherds of a congregation can help out the preacher in that case, because we have ministers. You and I both know ministers who they're at congregations where they don't have a secretary. There's no other minister on staff, so they're doing the bulletin. They're writing a bulletin article. They're answering the phone. They're teaching every time in the pulpit. They're teaching every Bible class. They're doing every Wednesday night devotional. It's hard to do the legwork to be totally and completely prepared, not to say that that's an excuse necessarily, but there can be some benefit of stepping in and taking some of that load off of your preacher if he's having to teach every Bible class and that kind of thing. So, and it would be easy if you're doing all of that week in, week out for it to fuse together and there not really be a separation. Talk a little bit about the differences between teaching and preaching. What do you see as, because some say, there really is no difference. Both of them are a lecture style and you just, be quiet, let me finish and, that's it. But there probably should be some differences, right?
I think that there are. And what I did was I noticed that there was some passages, and I just have a couple here, that reference teaching and preaching in the same sentence, separately. So the Bible differentiates the two words.
Right.
And so, for example, Matthew 11:1, when Jesus had finished giving instructions to his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. So they're different Greek words. If they were the same thing, then we would say he went on from there to teach and teach, or preach and preach. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not what it says. That's not what he did.
Right.
Luke 21, on one of the days while he was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel. And then last one, and there's many of them, Acts 5:42. Every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching.
Right.
So what are those Greek words? What are the differences? Teaching is didasko. That means to teach or instruct. And so that's what teaching is. So that's that is that slowing down, explaining more, digging in deeper and thoroughly teaching and instructing. And I want to use your sermon from yesterday as an example. Then there's two different words used for preaching. Caruso is to proclaim, announce, make known. Mm-hmm. This one is harder to pronounce.
Evangelion?
Evangelism comes out of the same root word. There's an N sound in there that you can't really see, but it means to proclaim, announce good news, proclaim the gospel. So really very essentially the same meaning there, but it's this idea of proclaiming the good news and gospel. Those are kind of fundamentals we know, but the Bible does use them differently. And so preaching Like, okay, I want to use your sermon example yesterday morning for an example. It was the last in a series on me, we, and he. And this one was about a message really more to those already divorced, right?
Right.
But there was something for everybody. Someone that maybe in the midst of which way is this going to go in my marriage or a healthy marriage, there's something for everybody. So a way in which you proclaimed the preaching aspect of that is there was I meant to go back and write this down. So help me make sure I said it right. You phrased it real well, but it was God always. What was the first part? God always stoops down for the hurting.
Yeah, God will always exalt the ideal.
Yeah.
But he'll always stoop down to the hurting.
Yeah.
And the point was that when it comes to divorce, we know what the standard is: one man, one woman for life.
Yeah.
The exception that's made in Matthew 19, and we know that's ideal. But at the end of the day, ideal will always intersect with real.
Yeah.
And the reality is, marriages end.
Yeah.
Their divorce occurs. So then what?
So what you were doing in that point, the way I see this, and others, was you're proclaiming this good news, this pointing us to God, and ultimately, as you do, you're bringing us to here's who God wants us to be
Sure.
as followers of Christ. Now, I would say that's the proclaiming, the preaching. Within that, though, I think what we see in reality is, especially in the sermon, preaching and teaching are mixed in.
Yeah.
So the teaching part would be you walked us through those three main different texts,
Right.
and you explained the different perspectives, the way those three rabbis approached the teaching on putting away a spouse. So that's that teaching, that instructing, and that's helping people understand, okay, I see what God's word is saying. It's digging in a little more. Now, one of the constraints that we have oftentimes in our sermons today is our sermon lengths have gotten shorter, and that's just a cultural thing. A good friend of ours, a member there and a wonderful teacher, Ravi, is he's from Malaysia, so he kids with me that 45 minutes isn't enough time.
Right, he could go on for hours. Yes.
And it's all content.
It is.
It's all well-studied content.
Right.
Okay, so it's simply culture. And I tell them, if I was there with you, I would be expected to go an hour, and I better be ready to do that. Here, there's an adaptation to, that's just not what the culture is, and I think that can get very local to your particular congregation.
Sure.
But certainly in American culture, it's oftentimes shorter. Now, in a classroom, we still have 40 to 45 minutes.
Right.
So that just the difference in time allows you to do more. And so you could cover more, and we were talking about this morning, you had a lot more you had initially planned for the sermon.
Right.
But you decided for various reasons to cut some of that out and to really zero in. So time constraints is part of that. Teaching, the luxury of that is you can dig in and go kind of at a slower pace.
Sure.
If you're doing something like a big book like Luke, you don't have as much of a slow pace.
Right.
But in a sermon series, you can craft that whole series that way. So I think understanding the way the Bible uses the two words, but I think what we see in reality is teaching and preaching in a sermon really go together, because you can't just proclaim the good news. You have to instruct in the word. And in a classroom, you're not just instructing in the word only, because I think in the classroom or in the pulpit, you're getting to that good news of the gospel. Mm-hmm. You don't want to leave somebody with just, your the layout of the temple and the ordinances of temple worship.
Right. How does that help me?
So you got to get somewhere with that.
Right.
And again, we're not saying that's unimportant. That's in Scripture.
Sure.
But why is that in Scripture? And so that's what we try to do in our Bible classes. I'm fortunate to be able to plan our adult Bible classes. So what I do, like, for example, we've got a class on Deuteronomy coming up. Mm-hmm. Well, The theme is Deuteronomy, a heart for God.
Right.
And so what we do is we write, like in college course description books, we write a course description for each class. So that teacher is going to get some resources that might be helpful, but they're getting this clear course description on here's where we want you to go with the class.
Absolutely.
So we're not saying Deuteronomy. So I sit there and cover every verse. What do you think that means? What do you think? What do you think? We're saying, I want you to pull back that bow and arrow and aim at this heart for God, that theme that pierces through that book of Deuteronomy. And ultimately, then it lands on the teacher to be able to accomplish that. But I think that also helps them in preparation. Teachers have said that they appreciate knowing where you want me to go, what you want me to do in the class.
Right.
And it's just training on how to do that well. I think it's a real art and science, both preaching and teaching.
I think it is, and I think you can sit there and you can tell the class, hey, for homework, I want you to memorize these 5 verses.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much I know if I don't put it into action.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Being an effectual doer is not just about knowing what the word says or being able to recite all of Psalm 119. It's about being able to take the message of Psalm 119, and put it into action, understanding how this applies to my life and how it makes me better.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we often stop short. We're good at giving information, but taking that information and talking about how it turns into transformation, how I can apply this, that's really the key, because no Bible study, no Bible class has made the full impact until you move from the observation, the interpretation, until you move from those things to the application, right?
Yeah. I heard someone use the illustration between preaching and teaching in this way, and it's what you were saying essentially. And the example they gave is, imagine the bank where your mortgage is or car loan, whatever, and the bank calls you and says, hey, your loan, your debt has been forgiven. Mm-hmm. We wiped it out, 0 balance. So you're ecstatic, you can't believe it, but that's all they say. And that's the proclamation.
Sure.
We're going to erase your debt. Your next question might be, probably, is this a scam? Is this real? But one of your next questions is, well, what do I need to do? How? What? So that's the instruction. Okay, what we need you to do is, we need you to come down here, fill out this form. Yeah. That's here's how you're going to do this. We proclaim to you the message. So if they just said, hey, we're gonna wipe out your mortgage, click. Wait,
yeah.
What do I need to do?
I need more information.
Right now. Or if they just called and said, what I need you to do is come down to the bank right now.
Yeah.
Wait, what? What's going on here? They go together. So that preaching, that proclamation, and that education and instruction, because like you just said, what we want is transformation. We want stronger and stronger followers of Christ. When we say turn to Christ, proclaim the good news and all of that, well, how? The men and brethren, what shall we do?
Yeah.
And then he instructed them.
Yes.
He proclaimed Jesus.
Yeah.
Then he instructed them on how to respond to the message.
Excellent point. Because I think we look at the differences on the surface between the two, and we say, well, a Bible class is more of discussion, and preaching is not, and when in actuality there's a lot of similarities,
Yeah.
and they go together. And in fact, if you this, I'm not real keen on auditorium classes, because people spread out, they want to make comments and you can't hear their comments. And, so I mean, when I teach an auditorium class, very rarely do I, but when I do, I always tell people no comments.
Yeah. Well, in fact, we've just said, the elders said, we're not doing it, because what happens is people just want to, they want to hear themselves talk.
Yeah. Well, they want to make a comment that's
no one can hear it.
Unrelated, or one that's so obvious, and so nobody can hear it. Or if they have a question, nobody can hear it. And so what we have done is just said, we're not going to do that, but, or save your questions to the end, and we'll get to the end. But that is one of the things that is a big difference, and maybe good to talk about this, is when you're preaching, you kind of, for lack of a better term, have a captive audience.
Yeah.
There isn't discussion. Although Paul discoursed with the brethren until at Troas, there could be, but typically in our traditional setting, you're just preaching and everybody's listening.
Yeah.
And maybe afterwards they come up and make a comment or ask a question. Whereas in a Bible class, it lends itself to more discussion. And some churches, their Bible classes are all about discussion. But what do you do when you have that person who hijacks the class? Or wants to hijack the class, and they might as well be teaching it because they're talking more than the teacher is.
Yeah.
Giving their input, wanting to make comments over and over again, not having that filter to realize, okay, I may be talking too much here. How do we handle that as a Bible class teacher?
Well, that can happen, and I think some people are real good at that, and some people can be too stern, and some people can let it go. So it can be kind of a tricky thing. I think when that teacher is prepared and they know where they're going and what needs to be accomplished in that class as a part of that series, perhaps,
right,
then they know. And Stephen Rechtenwald does this well. His discussion, his questions are very well designed to elicit engagement, conversation, all of that.
They're focused.
But it's very much about where he's going in the class. It's not just, anybody got any questions or comments? So, I think if you need to plan your class with discussion and involvement, prepared for that, you intend that to happen, but it's all about the lesson that you're teaching.
Right.
And so when, sometimes most of the time just redirecting the person, they bring up some odd, or off the subject topic. Okay, we can talk about that after class or something, or sometimes just, oh, good point, or that's interesting,
just
and
move
keep
on.
Going. If it becomes a problem, I think probably just asking them in the class, hey, we've only got so much time after class.
Right.
We've only got so much time or whatever. Most people, once you address it kind of publicly,
they do.
But, it can catch you off guard too when you're teaching and your mind is on the lesson, and then they raise their hand and they have some, or they talk forever in their response.
Right.
That's another thing.
Yeah.
And so I think that's on the teacher to prepare well, to plan for planned conversation. So you design it instead of letting the class just, come up with it.
Yeah, keeping control is about being, like you said, focused.
You're a facilitator, so you
Yes.
need to facilitate this class.
Absolutely.
I do think that method is, when we think of differences between teaching and preaching a lot, I think in our minds a lot of times nowadays we think of the differences in method or approach, and naturally in a large auditorium, you just can't, because of the setting, engage in certain ways. But you can ask rhetorical questions. You can ask for raise your hand, nod, or the things. You can do some types of engagement things, and I think some people overdo that. But it all needs to be very natural, not just for the sake of doing it. But in a class, you're right. In a class, you could do table discussions like we see, and then share with the whole class, or just general Q&A, or call on a person, let a person read. So I think that gets down to teaching method.
Yes.
And there's various methods to use. Like you said, what Paul did, he discoursed with the brethren. And your setting really makes a difference. If you're in a smaller room, a smaller congregation, really lends itself to that. And that's kind of neat when you can do that. But not everybody likes that. And so you kind of need to know what am I comfortable with? And maybe you need to get comfortable with some others, but know kind of where your zones are too. And some people can do a couple of different things, and some can. That's okay.
It is, and I think you're right. Knowing what is your style, what is the audience need, what best gets the point across, because different subjects require a different method. Some of our Bible classes are going to be textually based. We're going to study the Gospels, but then we may do a topical study where we talk about current events or cultural trends and how they're affecting the church and things like that. So obviously the setting matters. Also, the subject matter dictates kind of what you're doing as well. I know of preachers, have friends that preach that they prefer one over the other. They say, I find preaching a lot easier than I do teaching. And I think, I'm kind of that way too. And I've tried to, for the sake of this podcast, try to think, why is that? Why am I more comfortable in the pulpit than I am teaching a class? I used to be a school teacher. Why am I more? And I think it's because, you're preparing so much more to some degree for the reaction in your Bible class, depending on what the topic is. I'm trying to think ahead. Okay, so what if they ask me this question, or what if, because I don't want to be caught off guard. I don't want to not be able to answer a question about it. Whereas when you're preaching, you like you said, they're just sitting there. Our tradition is people sit there and you speak. But Bible class is a little more, for me at least, intimidating in that aspect, because I'm going to get a question that maybe I don't know the answer to, and that's okay. But I don't think it's okay sometimes in my own mind. I think, well, what if I'm not prepared for this or that? And then I also think that, for me, preaching is easier than teaching a Bible class, because you do only have a certain amount of time, and we, for whatever reason, we do the quarter thing, and I don't think we need to be locked into that. No. But if you're doing the Gospel of John, that's hard to do in a quarter. And so I'm always anxious, feeling like, have I gotten to where I need to? Am I covering all the material? So I think that gets to me a little bit also. Whereas from the pulpit, I kind of have some leeway. Okay, we didn't get through this enough, so I'm going to go over to Sunday night, and we're going to hit that even further. It shouldn't be that way, but I kind of feel that way about it. And I don't know, I'd like to hear from some of our preachers and hear what they have to say about that. Why is one a little more comfortable for you than others? And what are some of the things that you see that make one a little more difficult than the other?
Well, and possibly also who you saw and who influenced you, coming up. That can have, who was your preacher or preachers growing up, that might have an effect, or who you listen to, if you listen to certain preachers. But I would imagine, just because that's the majority of what you do, that's you get into that zone, that groove, and that's just second nature for you. Yeah,
our elders are so good, and they have been ever since I've gotten to Oldham Lane. When I came there, I was like, I understand that, this is a larger congregation, and there are a lot of expectations perhaps, and a lot of, you're going to have your hands in a lot of things. I really want to focus on preaching and writing and that kind of thing. And I said, so how much of this other stuff do you expect me? I said, I'm going to be involved in all of it. But I said, for instance, how much teaching do you, how many quarters a year? 2 out of the 4 or 3 out of the 4? How many? And I remember one of our elders looked at the rest of them, and then looked at me and said, it's whatever you want. However much you want to teach is fine with us. But I said, okay, so if you're gonna allow me to do that, I don't want to teach on Sunday morning if I don't have to, because we have 2 services. It kind of, for me anyway, it jumbles all together in my head, and so
that's a lot.
I teach. When I teach on Sunday nights. It's not that I hadn't taught on Wednesday nights. It's not that I hadn't taught on Sunday mornings, but I'm grateful that I have the opportunity that, I focus on preaching, and I can teach when I want to. And I teach at least 1 quarter, if not 2 every year. And I enjoy that. Of course, you being over our education, you've made it a lot easier for people like me, and saying, hey, how about a month on, like, I've got Holy Spirit coming up. How about a month on the Holy Spirit? So that makes it easier too. A lot of preachers don't have that luxury, and I realize that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit further in this series. But I can see how it can be very difficult when you're teaching both Bible classes, Wednesday night, Sunday morning, preaching both sermons Sunday night. I can see how it all kind of mixes in together, and it becomes difficult.
Well, and to switch methods is only more work.
That's right.
So to do 2 to 3 sermons a week, and then a class.
Absolutely.
And you say, I want interaction in the class. Now you got to plan for that, and you've got more content because you typically have a longer time frame. So that's a lot.
And if you've been somewhere a long time, it's kind of like, I've exhausted, a lot of my ideas. So now what? You feel like, even me being somewhere 13 years, you feel like it's getting harder and harder to come up with a different way to take on the same old subject.
Yeah.
And, some people say, well, you don't have to come up with anything new and fresh, but you do feel the challenge of that. You really do. You feel like, I've got to, if I'm talking about baptism, I want to try to find a way to discuss it in a Bible class or from the pulpit in a way that maybe we hadn't thought about before or something like that, or present it in a new and a fresh way. That's always a challenge, when you've been somewhere a long time.
Yeah, I thought of another example from your sermon yesterday morning where there could be a difference between how we approach this in a sermon setting, would call preaching, typically, and a classroom setting. So maybe that's more of the difference is delivering a sermon versus in a classroom than it is preaching and teaching so much. But it was marriage, divorce, or remarriage was essentially the topic. And it was Malachi, is it verse 16? I can't remember.
Yeah, chapter
God
2,
hates
verse
divorce.
16. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's not in every translation.
Right.
So I typically use the ESV in New American Standard and others include God hates divorce. So in your sermon, you didn't address that. Right. It's in many translations, perhaps most. In the ESV and some others, it's not there. It's worded a little differently. And in my study Bible in the notes, it said this is one of the most difficult Old Testament passages to translate. And sometimes they put who is doing the hating or no longer loving, in other words. Is it God or is it the husband? And that's kind of where that lands on the two different interpretations. ESV lands on husband no longer loving his wife instead of God saying, I hate divorce. So it's kind of two different angles on that. You could have mentioned that in your sermon, but like we said, you've got only so much time to do what you're trying to do. And I know you were aware of that topic. It's not like that was missed on you. Now, in a class setting, though, where say you've got 45 minutes, you might take 5 minutes to walk people through that.
Absolutely.
So that's a difference of luxury of time. The setting makes a difference. What you were trying to do was not necessarily address that, but it was to provide healing to those who are divorced, maybe those who are in the midst of marriage problems, and to everybody, as well as that instruction. In the classroom, you just have a little more luxury to cover some of that stuff.
You do. And
you wouldn't have been wrong to address that in the sermon,
right.
But you had to get something done. And so you chose not to.
Right. I know for me, and our other ministers watching can help us on this by giving their insight and their advice and commentary. But for me, when I'm doing a sermon, I've got one goal in mind. I've got one singular focus from start to finish where I want to end and what I want to get to. I've got maybe 3 points, but I've got a major point that I want to make. And the one yesterday on divorce, I even said it in the beginning, is not a deep dive discussion into who can be married and who can get remarried and all that kind of stuff. That was not the goal. The goal yesterday was to give hope to divorced people everywhere, that you can still be useful in your service to God. Yeah. That was the one goal. Now, that same topic in a Bible class, the goal might be different. The goal might be still to give people hope and every divorced person to help them to heal. But the goal might be a textual study of Matthew chapter 19 and all the ins and outs, the context, what's going on here, how do we come to Matthew 19 and take it and apply it to our lives and maybe even our personal situation and teaching it to others and handling, divorce dilemmas and things like that. So you take a little bit different approach when it's a Bible class versus a sermon. Yeah. I just don't want my sermons to be a lecture style to where I'm just disseminating information. I want the sermon to come to a point where people say, okay, I can leave here this morning a better disciple because I understand how to apply this to my life. Not that I don't want that in a Bible class either, but let's face it, in the Bible class, you're able to dig a little deeper and look at some of these other aspects that you don't want to get bogged down in the sermon. If that makes sense.
In communication, there's essentially 3 basic types. There's communication to persuade, to inform, or to entertain.
Right.
So in persuade is really the main approach being taken in preaching and teaching, I believe.
Right.
Inform is going to be there. That's that teaching and that instruction.
Absolutely.
You have to educate people in the Word, but you want to persuade people to turn their lives over to Christ and give that hope. And so both are there, and maybe that's kind of similar to the preaching and teaching going together.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's about time to wrap up.
I guess so.
I appreciate the discussion, and I hope that all of our viewers and or listeners appreciate the discussion as well. If you would, let us know. We'd like to hear from you. What are your comments about this discussion? How do you handle the divide or the difference between teaching and preaching? How do you approach one versus the other? And what are some pitfalls or some difficulties that you face? Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. You can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. And please spread the word about this podcast. We're on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, of course, right here on Facebook. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next week, Jake will be with me. We'll talk about another matter associated with ministry that maybe we don't talk about too often, and I hope you'll tune in. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.